Hello, viewers, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us here at Page Turners Plus as we continue to reflect on various Caribbean books that we select. Today, we'll be reflecting on Donna Hemans' The House of Plain Truth. To tell you a bit more about the novel and Donna Hemans, we have Paula.
Thank you, Roger. Donna Hemans is a Jamaican writer. The House of Plain Truth is her third novel. It is 1993, and the novel's protagonist, Pearline, newly retired from a 32-year career as a nurse in Brooklyn, had returned to Jamaica to nurse her father on his deathbed. After their father passes, her sisters want to sell their family home. Pearline resists their efforts, insisting that to sell the house would betray their father's memory. The ensuing struggle between the sisters will dredge up long suppressed, painful family secrets, which force Pearline to confront predicaments arising from her family's migration to Cuba in the early 20th century and her own migration to the United States in 1961.
All right. Thank you very much, Paula. So I guess we could jump in sort of where Paula began her synopsis, where she mentioned that, Pearline returned to nurse her father. So Pearline often speaks of Rupert's legacy of failure. Do you agree with her assessment, Eric? You seem
Yeah, that I thought about. I thought about that throughout reading the book, especially once you get into the middle of the book, and those things start to come out in the conversation and the ruminations that Pearline has. I get where it comes from. Definitely, I think for a person like Rupert and other men of his time in that context, in that social but also economic context of the broader Caribbean, where men from the English-speaking Caribbean would go off to places like Panama, Costa Rica, Cuba, to make some money, get enough money to go back home and buy a piece of land that would be seen as a success. And Rupert was unable to do that. Uh, so from his perception of himself, and probably also his wife Irene's perception, it was failure. But I think Perline is, well, she's definitely trying to rehabilitate that perception, but I think she has her own issue as well, which I think she inherited the same type of thinking. So it's complicated. I don't have a good response to that besides just what I said. It's just it's unevenness, but it has to be framed within the societal expectations, but also in individuals' expectations as well.
I think it also has to be contextualized for the time because part of me throughout the story wanted to forgive Rupert because he was a man of the times. I don't think the expectations that we have today of men could be applied to Rupert. He clearly had some demons that he was dealing with. He tried to better his family's situation by going to Cuba. As Eric mentioned back then, many Caribbean men went to Panama, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, for example. And in his case, he didn't see any success. He came back to Jamaica pretty much worse off than he left. So he was a failure, but I think it was forgivable failure.
I had a quarrel with the description of Rupert as a failure. This is a man who kept his family together. I mean, he's far from a perfect husband and father, far from it. But I think he was a devoted husband and father. He had his failings. Um, if we're not expecting people to be Jesus, I think he certainly made a success of his family life, and so I had a real problem with him being described as a failure.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that, Paula. I think the story really touched me in lots of ways. Because I think I've struggled is probably not the right word, but I identify as someone who recognizes themselves as a daddy's girl when other people might think that their dad has failed or whatever. I could see myself being very much in Perline's shoes of being haunted by having to have to fulfill his last wish if he asked me to. Um, and agree that like the devotion that Pearline has for him, the relationship they have, the depth of care that he's clearly given her as a child, has nurtured her sense of success being possible, kind of actually chafes against this idea that he's a failure. Because if he's a failure, how has she learned to succeed? And I would also challenge the idea of failure and success, because it seems to be seen by quite materialistic terms. We're really talking only in the sense that he didn't come back full of gold. But he did come back with a family that built a home that Pearline always could return to, that was a source of comfort to her when she was living a difficult life in America. So to what degree that can be considered a failure, I think is really only in the sense of the material. And even then, they did build something that they, he didn't have to go work in the bauxite factory. He able to live autonomously outside of the pressures of the world that was around them, where lots of people didn't. So even again in the material, I'm not even sure that it could be classed truly as a failure.
Yeah, I agree completely. Guess what? When you think about, what happened with the next generation, and I mean, even in the book, Perlin says they were all able to move to the middle class, and the fact that, the story about him having the heads of cattle, one for each daughter, so that they could go to school, and he was able to provide them with the opportunity to have higher education. One was an accountant, the other one was a principal, and then Perline was a nurse. And then you look at their children. For me, yeah, he was a failure in his own mind, I think, just because of what he originally thought he was going to be doing when he left and went to Cuba. And I think it's unfortunate that because of that, Perline also just kept thinking of this whole legacy of failure when there's so much evidence to the contrary.
It's an interesting question because it also brings up the kind of pressure that people who migrate or leave the shores and go away to make a better life, the sort of pressure that they put on themselves and society puts on them as well. So they're judged. And what you find happening is migrants who return, because they're sucked into this judgment thing, they tend to make a statement when they come home. They build a big house, far too big for them. They do things, ostentatious things, that just to prove the opposite, that they're not failures. So it's an interesting question. The answer I have to the question itself is that I don't think that Rupert was a failure. I think, as Francine said, he set a lot of things in motion for, the upward progression of the family, So
I just want to pick up what you said there, Tony. I really love this about the book, just generally, that it picked up these very kind of taboo subjects almost about returnees and when people come home, how they live, how they integrate or don't, how they come home to feel it's not home anymore in the way that they remember. And I thought she did that really, really well. As a diaspora kid, it's something that in my own family we've grappled with a lot, and I think it's such a taboo subject to talk about how home isn't actually that much home when you go home and you don't belong anymore, and how distressing that can be. But the relationship between Pearline and her sisters, I think, really evokes that, like the two that stayed versus the one that left. They call her boasty when she's trying to help. They don't see the suffering that she went through in the US trying to send money back to make sure that the place that she thought of as a home remained a home for her family and for her own children. And then, yet, as soon as she gets back to actually live the life that she's finally able to, they're trying to take it away from her, and the damage that does to her psychically is incredible, and it's it manifests physically. I don't think I've ever seen a novel, and I don't know if you guys have, where they've dealt with this so sensitively and so completely, because you do see the sister side of the story. You can kind of see it from their perspective, but you also see it from hers, and it's a nice way of kind of really grappling with this idea of home and how it's so slippery, for lack of a better word.
I don't know that you see the sister side of the story the way you know. I think we see it entirely from Perline's perspective. Perline feels put upon by her sisters. We hear them calling her the boasty Miss America. Incidentally, in Jamaica, we wouldn't say boasty. I know Donna Hemans spelt it with a T. I think that's just for non-Jamaicans to understand it. We'd say boasty. But I don't think you see the flip side. Tony kind of uh, you know went into it a little bit when he speaks about returnees coming home and building these grand castles on a hill to make a statement. And the resentment that they get here is because of that nonsense. Um, Tony and I know returnees who come back. They barely went to school, but there are authorities on every subject. It's really quite annoying.
Yeah,
So
it is.
we didn't get that perspective. We didn't hear from the sisters. And I think the sisters would have had a lot to say.
But they do though, because you do hear their voices in the novel frequently when they tell her that why doesn't she want to live up where the returnees live, or they say when she goes to help her dad, they're like, finally she can help. We've been doing it for all these years, so they're not absolutely silent. I know what you mean. The
No,
story is very much from
you're
Darlene's
getting that you're
perspective.
getting that sarcasm coming from them, but the reasons, the thought process is that what Paul is saying. A lot of returnees come back with this qualification of having been overseas. I am now educated. Mind you, schooling went up as far as primary school, and they're coming back to have conversations with university graduates and so on, but they never went away. So being overseas is the only qualification you need to be an authority on everything. And that is what brings in that sort of resentment.
But Kesua, Perlene, in my view, was almost everything that you would not expect from one of those bossy returnees. Because, for example, she wanted to return to the very humble home that her parents had. She didn't want to go live up on the hill with with her fellow returnees. They offered her an opportunity to be a savior, kind of like with the nursing opportunity that she had. I mean, she eventually gave in and did it, but she resisted the urge to do it, which a lot of returnees would probably jump at that, and in this day and age would take pictures and say, "Oh, look at me on the in this community offering free healthcare." And at no point I got the impression that she was trying to show off on her sisters. I think she was in a very way the opposite of all the stereotypes that we just associate with returnees. So I think Perlene was quite fine in my view.
I agree with
Yeah,
RJ. I think the stereotype is what we're discussing. I don't think Perlene herself was that, but the sisters is just a reflex action. It's
right.
what.
I
eh,
think that, the sisters' resentment, I guess, is what led them to treat her that way, even though she didn't act that way. Like they resented the fact that she left, and so they're treating her as though she's being the bossy Miss America type, which she definitely was not.
But it was so unfounded though, because the sisters were clearly living comfortably in Jamaica. I mean, they were middle class people. They weren't struggling. So it was unfounded resentment in my view.
But I think that's the strength of the novel, isn't it? That it's picking out how, like, even in a context where the other sibling isn't like that, she's still excluded because she was absent. She just wasn't there. She missed all the weddings and the kids' birthday parties. She missed the caring responsibilities that they had suffered through is probably not the right word, but they had taken on over years and years. And she was there to be a bit of a savior at the last minute, to hold his hand as he was dying. For the last 6 months, she was there. But how long had he been in that bed for? Being cared for by them, making sure that, and if they weren't physically caring for him personally, making sure that the nurses were good and that they were coming regularly and that he was getting what he needed. So I think, yeah, it's about how even when you're not that bossy character, migration itself creates fissures in the family, right? Fissures. That's what I'm looking for. Fissures,
Fishes.
fissures between siblings who would otherwise be close knit, who would otherwise be happy together. It's about kind of the damage that migration does, full stop, whether or not it's a successful one or not.
Yeah, I because what I resonate with that point, but I'm gonna come back to something that Paula mentioned, and possibly, not at least in my perspective, not possibly, but I believe what you just stated is actually a flaw in the novel, and that the characterization of the sisters is rather flat. I was hoping for a more a fully fleshed out characterization of both of those sisters, and from beginning to the end, they they I didn't see nuance with the sisters, and I was hoping because Hermina and Eileen were like the same to me. They were like one character but two people. So and yeah, I think the unfairness of their criticism we can all agree, and I think that's part of the story. And I think that's part of the story. Generally, when people go somewhere, they leave home and then come back. I mean, shoot. I think whenever I go home, it's kind of the same, and uh, that's one reason why I like this novel so much, because it does remind me of my own experience, even though I moved from one part of the country to another. But anybody who knows anything about New Orleans, Louisiana, knows that it's its own place. We just happen to be part of the United States, thanks to Napoleon and also thanks to Toussaint and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. But but I get that. I mean, people have different expectations of you because you went off somewhere and you come back and they think that you know better than they do. But for me, I would love to go back home and move into my old house. I'll go back and live into the shotgun house that I grew up in. So, uh, but but the tension is there, and that's something that's a thread that's weaved throughout the novel. Um, and it's almost universal, a theme when you talk about people who immigrate and then return home. I mean, even back in Liberia, they call people who go to the UK, go to the United States, and come back to Liberia, even for a short time, they call them Bentus, because the people come back and say, "Well, I've been to here, I've been to there," and stuff like that.
Yeah, in the Francophone world, in the Caribbean, they call them nécropolitains, right? So they're like metropolitan, but they're black, and perhaps they come back with these overseas qualifications that you talk of, right? And Fanon writes about it, right? They come out with a different accent, and suddenly they can't speak Creole anymore, right? So I think there's a lot of in the Caribbean imaginary stories about people who go and come back. But I think it's actually something unique about perhaps places that have been colonized and have been taught that there's a bigger, better world elsewhere. Because I think about my own return to the UK after spending 10 years in the Caribbean. No one thought I'd come back. I should come back a big shot. I should build a big house. There wasn't any expectation that I was better than anybody else. It was like, welcome home. We're glad you're back. What took you so long? Also, why did you come back? It was nice there. So there's some elements that are kind of local as well.
And I mean, it's as true as it is imaginary, because you do have people who, as you mentioned, they come back and think that their boarding pass was somehow some degree certificate that qualifies them in everything. So it isn't necessarily a strange concept, but in this novel, definitely Donna Hemans demonstrates that there are exceptions to the rule, or exceptions to the stereotypes. But I think what we'll do now is we'll take the reading, and we have Donna Hemans to do that for us, and then we'll come back and we'll have a very spicy discussion after that. Stay tuned.
Hi, I'm Donna Hemans, the author of The House of Plain Truth, and I'll be reading from the first chapter, which takes place when Pearline has returned to Jamaica to help take care of her father. And here in this section, he has just named all his children. Rupert named his children, and now Pearline begins to think that some people refuse to be forgotten. These siblings of hers who have lived only in her family's collective memory of a moment on a wharf in Santiago de Cuba, want to be heard. That moment, which marks the last time the living members of her family were together, is stamped in her memory. She replays it now as she has done over the years. Rupert wears his best suit and hat. He's never without his hat. And her mother, Irene, wears a starched white dress, her belly big with the baby she would name Ermina. Pearline is 4 and Eileen 7. Those are the two girls who returned in 1933 to Jamaica. Their oldest sister, Annie, is already a married woman who chooses to stay behind in Cuba. And David and Gerardo, soon to be men, are staying behind too. Irene extracts a promise from Annie to take care of the boys. The goodbyes are loud and long, and the voices like a cacophony of birds, English and Haitian Creole spoken by the people who are leaving, and Spanish from those overseeing the departures. Annie leans over, whispers, "On a clear day, you can see Cuba from there." Pearline believes her, and she and Eileen look out at the blue sea for a glimpse of the distant island, Jamaica. And then they are gone. The last two baby girls in the family repatriated at the government's expense to an island they had never known. Ermina was nearly born on the ship, but Irene makes it to shore before the baby comes. There isn't room on the ship even for a song. A single whistle maybe, but not a song. Rupert wants no disturbance, no outward signs of displeasure or anxiety or disappointment. A ship's passage paid for by the government isn't the way he wants to return home. He wants to come home like the men who went to Panama, the Colon man with his gold chain and pocket watch. So he finds fault in everything: the waves that rock the boat, the men who report from deck on the land visible in the distance, the clouds that roll behind, threatening rain. Pearline and Eileen nervous and fidgeting, looking forward. From where they stand, there is no looking back. Even if they could have looked back, Rupert would have ordered them not to. From the moment he stepped onto the ship, he turned his back on Cuba and his children left behind on the wharf, until now, this moment when he calls the forbidden names.
All right, welcome back. And just before we took the reading, we were discussing Rupert's perceived legacy of failure as well as the story of migration as presented in the novel. So I wanted to throw out to the panel whether Pearline's narrative or perspective of Rupert is diminished or tainted by the fact that she was away for so long. And the reason I ask that is the revelation that Rupert had an outside child shocked Pearline, yet Eileen and Hermina appeared to have been relatively unfazed by it. What do you think accounts for that? From my view, I think it's because they saw more, they heard more, they were literally in the epicenter of all this, and I'm sure when Irene and Rupert had their little arguments, they must have heard it. That's my view. I don't know what others think.
I think also, I agree with you, Roger, but I think also Pearline was a daddy's girl. She even at her late stage in life, she was surprised that she hadn't thought about the pain that her father put her mother through. So I think it may be as simple as that.
Yeah, I definitely agree there that she was a daddy's girl, and Rupert could do no wrong in her eyes. And and even after, even in death, she fought for his legacy. And I think that was clear. So even if she got hints that Rupert was this another man than she thought, I don't think she would have taken that up significantly. Yes, well?
I don't think she thought he was another man, but I just think she didn't know, and her sisters blatantly did. They were totally unsurprised by it. Maybe, and don't forget the little boy, he's a big boy in the book. But Derek talks about having come home in the summer and spent time there. So they were probably aware of that. Whereas if she'd not been there at the time the child came home, the grandchild came home, she'd be completely oblivious. So the question I think is, why didn't they tell her? Why did she not know? And she only found out when her half brother phoned.
I don't think Derek stayed there though. I don't think Derek knew his grandfather. He remember his father would have had relatives on his mother's side. So I got the impression, the book didn't say so in so many words, but I got the impression that when he spent summers in Jamaica, it was with his mother's side of the family.
Yeah, I agree. I think at first I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then I realized that when he said I spent summers here, he meant Jamaica. He didn't mean like at this house and that, because he was talking about his cousins and stuff. So I'm assuming that, and I mean, his father probably wasn't an only child either, right? We know that maybe, who knows, maybe he had other brothers and sisters. And I really think that, yeah, just the fact that Pearline wasn't there, is, why she didn't know. And also, we're talking about a small community in the Caribbean, like everybody knows everything. So yeah, there would have been rumors, and no one was surprised. The only one who was surprised was Perline. Even when they introduced him to the other bigger, wider family, they were just like, oh yeah, right, okay. And carried along smartly because, that's just normal.
I think it definitely shows the sort of secrets that are kept Caribbean families as the novelist centered in the Caribbean. I've had that experience myself in terms of my own family. I'm still discovering children that my uncle had. My uncle, I grew up with my uncle, and I'm still, they're like 78 now, 78, 79 years of age. And I'm still, my cousin would say, oh, this is my brother, right? Not my brother, but his brother, right? It's just like a normal thing in the Caribbean, man. There are family members who you don't know. But you see your auntie being very close to that person. You wonder why they're so close to that person. They know, but you don't know. And it's the novel really did, zero in on that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So all of that, but I do walk away from the text thinking that this is something that's normative. We have these experiences. We know if it's not your daddy, it's your grandpa or an uncle. So I wasn't taken so aback by it, and but yeah, the question is, why didn't Perline, or why didn't people tell her about that? Yeah, maybe it's the perception that the sisters had that, yeah, Perline is a daddy's girl, because definitely the sisters took up for Irene. They were still taking up for Irene even after Rupert's death. When I think that's probably why they wanted to do what they wanted to do with that house. It was to vindicate their mother, and also to basically to spite Rupert. Because I don't. I mean, you know how mamas could be sometimes. Uh, when they talking to their children and the daddy not around, it's, oh, that man, oh, da, 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 da. And so you hear that, and they say, well, daddy was no good. Daddy was stubborn. I said, well, he was stubborn. So yeah, I think they were playing sides, and this is part of the inheritance of secrets, intransigence, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, again. I mean, I'm miffed by Perline not knowing, and it's not like she was away from a Jamaican expatriate community, because she's right there. She's right there in Flatbush. I mean, I've been to Flatbush Avenue and Nostrum Avenue. It's like being in Kingston. So people know each other. So yeah, I think that's part of the drama of the text. But I think in real life, people say,
Eric,
don't know.
Eric, I don't think that's unrealistic. In my family, I hope none of my nobody from my family watches this episode. Um, we just discovered a cousin, and she's our age, and she looks like us. And we now recognize that our aunt, who was our matriarch at the time, she has since passed, knew about her and kept her brother's secret. So I don't think it's that hard to believe because I've experienced it.
Yeah, we've discovered cousins that, I mean, thankfully it wasn't me, but my cousins discovered their siblings in the most extraordinary of ways, multiple times. And sometimes it is a question that everybody knew except for them, And I think sometimes we forget that generations have different ways of knowing things. Like, it's always a surprise to me when my mum knows something about my dad's side of the family, and I'm like, you haven't spoken to anyone on that side of the family for like 25 years. How do you know what's going on in my cousin's life? When actually I only found out because I WhatsApp them, because I talk to them. You know, like, so people have ways of knowing things, but they also have ways of keeping secrets when they don't want you to know.
And I think it's also part of the whole thing with the sisters. They're like, why should we tell her anything? You know, she left, so hey, too bad for her. I think that, there was really that whole that relationship was really kind of about that, I think, She left, and so
Eric, what did you make of the Cuba storyline? I ask you directly because I think as a historian, I really enjoyed having that in. I think a lot of the times when we think about the 1930s and the labor rebellions, we hear kind of an offhand, and it's a lot of people came back from Cuba, but I've really heard people kind of explain why they came back from Cuba and under what circumstances. Like I think the 1930s, you hear about the Parsley Massacre, the Haitians and the Dominicans, and those tensions, but not necessarily how that might have impacted Jamaicans
Mm.
or how Cuba's own policies also, like, how it all worked. So I really appreciated that, but I don't know much about it. So I wonder, as a more senior scholar, you might be able to say how
Well, I
accurate
mean,
it felt
I
or how.
loved that part of the story, even though, yeah, I was not familiar with uh, the 33 law, anything like that. I mean, so I mean, definitely I knew about migrant workers coming from the English speaking Caribbean to Cuba, Dominican, and those places, but I didn't know anything about this law. Um, and it really put things in perspective. So I really love that she emphasized this because it gives us a broader perspective now. Because this happened in 1933, you get the massacre that happened in 1917. It puts what happened in the Dominican Republic in 1937 in a broader perspective. That this was this anti-black racism, true and through, and it's like, man, where could a black man go? you know, where he gonna go in this time where he can stretch out and be free. So no, I love that part. I mean, I took a lot of notes. Whenever she brought up the past like that, I was taking notes and I was thinking deeply about this. And nah, it was that was the sad that, for me, that was the sad part of the text.
Yeah,
Um,
actually, I went and unearthed essays about that because I had never heard of it either, and I have family who went to Cuba. In fact, I still have family in Cuba, um, and I had never heard of the mistreatment of Jamaicans and Haitians. Apparently, they really went to town on the Haitians. Um, so I actually went and dug up some essays on the matter, and there's a bit of scholarship on it. So wider reading for all of us.
Yeah, it definitely sparked my interest as well because I know of the Panama connection, especially a lot of Bajans went to Panama. I do know of that, and my grandmother was actually born in the Dominican Republic. Her mother and father were cane cutters in the Dominican Republic, and we never get the perspective that these people suffered tremendously in in these countries. We always get the sort of glorification, especially of Panama. We get the glorification that, oh, Caribbean people helped to build the Panama Canal, but we don't get the side that many of them died. Many of them did not make it back home. And yes, you do have the success stories where people settled in and became leaders. I think, especially in Panama, a few descendants of Bajans eventually got into politics, etc. But we never get the dark side, that people were chasing them, that they had to hide, that they and I mean, even to the point in the novel where they were saying, "Don't go outside lest you be mistaken for a Haitian." That when I read that, that sent chills. So I was glad for this perspective that Donna Hemans gave us, of the sort of Caribbean connection throughout the Hispanic side of things.
I think it also adds another side to this idea of like the returnee, like the Panama man that they kind of evoke, or the Colon man. Like, is it another version of the same boasty character that we talk about now? And that actually it was really hard for them as well. Actually, they struggled and suffered along and had to put on a brave face. And we just didn't know. You know, so all the kind of dreams that Rupert had of emulating these guys, actually, there was nothing to emulate at all, or nothing to hope for.
Actually, we have a folk song in Jamaica. 1, 2, 3, 4, Column and a come. I think Donna Hemans has it in the novel. I think she does mention it. But it's essentially making fun of the men who came back from Cologne wearing draped down in gold chains, because one of the what a part of the song says, ask him what he's wearing, a heavy gold chain. That's what the song says, and a gold chain with a watch. And you ask him what the time, and you look up on the sun. So, yeah. So yeah.
You know, as
There's
you
another
just
song in
mentioned
there,
that.
isn't there? There's another song in there as well.
Mhm.
I was reading in
There are several songs.
Yeah,
There
there
are
were a
several
few.
folk songs. She draws on lots of folk songs.
Mhm.
There is every time we think
I
about
think of
Dinah,
Dinah
Liza,
Watercombe,
come
yeah,
on,
I was
yeah,
right.
yeah.
so
She
I
had quite
recognized
a
it.
few. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
You know, as you just mentioned that, Paula. I mean, it was related to migration to America, but I thought of Louise Bennett's it's not colonization in reverse. It's can't remember one, but she said, "You come back with not even a gold teeth or gold chain around your throat." I can't remember the name of the poem now. Um, but I think that's what happened to a lot of the Cologne men and a lot of the men who went to Cuba. They it was by choice or force that they come back and pretend that all was well. In the case of Rupert, he didn't pretend. He suffered. I mean, he did pretend because he went back. So I think so. There was some pretense there because if he suffered greatly the first time around and he didn't even tell his wife, and it ended up going back. But what I wanted to move to now is throughout the narrative, you can't tell whether Perline is dreaming, reminiscing, or just living in the present. Does the novel suggest that the lines between memory, dreams, and family are inevitably blurry?
I think Donna Hemans also wanted to explore what so many Caribbean writers explore, the idea that material reality is not the only reality in our context. We see a lot of writers venturing into that area where they're suggesting that the way our ancestors perceived reality, where spiritual reality was not distinct from material reality. It was not something shocking or it wasn't so it's normal for us to think of the spirit world as real as the material world. And I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that's what Donna Hemans is exploring. She's simply endorsing the way our ancestors perceived the world and encouraging us to perhaps discard or at least put a question mark beside what our Western education teaches us about this about spiritual reality as opposed to material reality.
But you know, Paul, the more and more I read about the non-Western way and their relationship with the spirits, I'm at my old age of whatever it is, but I'm just beginning to understand the relationship that people, the non-Western world, have with spirits and their ancestors, and making it part of their reality. You know,
and that's because of our colonial education. Because it's not that it's not part of our reality. You know, I know my grandmother spoke about spiritual reality. Her in a very normal way. I grew up with my grandmother. Every time what we in Jamaica call a bat, which is really a big moth, came into the house, she would tell us which ancestor that was, and she would have conversations with it. And I know there are people who in Jamaica who find these moths, as the bats as we call them, very frightening. In my household, they were never frightening, never frightening. We always welcome them. And despite my Western education, one of them came into my house right here in St. Vincent. And I jokingly said to myself, oh, that is my cousin who had passed. We're extremely close. And then I decided I didn't want this bat, as we call them, to die. So I shooed it out of the house, and a bird swooped down and ate it, and I felt so guilty.
Oh.
So,
So your cousin died twice?
Yeah.
Mm.
So my grandmother is still in my head. Never mind the Western education that tried to persuade me that that is not, that is not possible.
Yeah.
I wonder
No,
if
I
it's-
get that. I get no. Excuse me, because no, I get that, and even the sisters push back on that and thinking that Perline wouldn't bother with that with those type of beliefs. Oh, you still believe in Duppy and spirits? I thought you would have. You've been in America, so I thought that wasn't a part of you. Um, but no, I mean, again, that's another thing that I appreciate about the novel is that uh, Donna Hemans went there, but that's so very much a part of who we are as African descended people here in the West. Those beliefs didn't die. I mean, they're stronger, I think, in certain places than they are in other places, but they don't die at all. Um, in the dreams, no, I really believe that was Rupert showing Perline what he saw when he was in Cuba. And so she's experiencing the past as he saw the past. And no, I mean, I have real experience, not with those types of dreams, but definitely, in the few years after my father passed, I was having at least 2 or 3 dreams about him every week, and they all took place in the house that I grew up in. And it was not the house that he was living at when he died, but the house where I was a little boy and grew up in. And so I understand that. I understand the visitation of an ancestor that comes to you. So yes, kudos to Donna Hemans for keeping that alive in us and saying, aha, we're not crazy for believing these things. Doesn't matter whether we're Christian, Muslim, Jew, non-aligned, whatever. This is part of who we are as African descended people.
I just wanted to point out that Toni Morrison speaks about having to re-educate herself out of her Western education, to embrace that part of our culture as well. She had to teach herself to forget what her Western education had taught her.
And I think that's the process I'm going through. I'm re-educating myself. But I was going to say, Eric, that one of the sisters, not just Pearlie, also had this sort of, although she didn't talk about it, but she also was being haunted, for want of a better word, by Rupert. So it wasn't just Pearline's experience. It was, I can't remember which sister it was.
Hermina.
It was
Hermina.
Hermina.
Was also having...
Hermina, yeah.
And
And I
it's only
think
when they acknowledged that they were able to be close.
right. And she I mean, it was happening since he passed, and she said nothing until the very end. Like, I think because, as we said, she and Eileen were really taken up for the mother. So she wasn't, I think she was resisting whatever it was Rupert was trying to tell her by just, denying or ignoring the fact that it was happening. But eventually she realized that she had to face the fact that Rupert was trying to tell her something and that she needed to do what it is that he wanted. Which I think, in a way, Eric maybe makes up for the characterization of the sisters. At least with Ermina, we kind of see her, how she kind of changed a bit, I guess. She kind of evolved a bit towards the end, and acknowledged that there was probably something to what Perline wanted. The fact that Rupert, because she's the one who, she snuck into the house, moved the furniture around to try to stop it from happening, I guess, and it still continued. So she kind of had no choice but just like be okay. All right, Daddy, whatever it is you want, we need to do it. So that was good for me, I think.
Unfortunately, though, Kesua, you wanted to make a very brief point.
I was just going to say very briefly.
Yes.
But I wonder how much of of the setting of the novel, very far from Kingston. Kingston's really just a blip. You see it very, very briefly. Allows for this kind of storytelling as well. This kind of Jamaica beyond Kingston, beyond the stereotypes. Was all I was going to add. The last question, but I can leave it.
But this is Donna Hemans' neighborhood. This is where she grew up. So I think all three of her novels are set in that same part of Jamaica. It's Western Jamaica, around Trelawney, Montego Bay, that kind of area. I like I said, I spent a lot of my childhood on a sugar plantation in that general area, so I know it very well.
All right. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. I mean, we could have kept going for an hour more, but the next time you see us, we'll be getting Donna Hemans' perspective on this book, and we'll have all our unanswered questions answered. So, thank you for joining us. Have a lovely day.